welcome. I'm glad you're back. We have had 2 good weeks of great ideas and great thoughts about how to be the church in a post-pandemic world. And we welcome Kotan back with us again. I'm not going to introduce her. You have all that bio stuff because we want to give her as much time to talk with us and guide our thoughts as we can. So how about if we start with a word of prayer? Gracious God, we thank you that while the world seems to be swirling around us in change, you are an ever-changing God. And just as you have walked with people through all different ages, you will walk through us through this very different time that we are entering. Be with us, guide us, speak to us. Use Kay this day to help us to see your vision for us in our context, with our people, in our community. For we pray these things in Christ's ever-changing name. Amen. Welcome, Kay. You're muted, Kay.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It looks like we still have some joining us. So we'll be letting them in. If you'll go on and mute yourself if you haven't done so already, because they are recording for some that aren't able to join us live. They'll be listening to the recording later. So we always like to have a clean recording if at all possible. So glad that you're here for session 3, being the church in the post-pandemic world. And we started off in session 1 talking about the ultimate relaunch playbook. And then last week, you'll remember that we started on the game changers. And specifically, we talked about the game changer of flexibility and being relational. So the 3rd and 4th game changer that we're going to talk about today is being visionary and being spiritually grounded. So if you're ready to get started, let's go on and I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. Sometimes the windows just have to be stacked in a certain way. There we go. Hopefully you can see. Are you seeing those all right now? Regina, are you able to see the screen all right?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I am.
Right. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. That's all right. All right. So let's begin by talking about the game changer of being a visionary. And just like in our previous 2 weeks, if you have a question that comes to mind as we are sharing this morning, just go on and put that in the chat box. Don't want you to forget that question. So just as it comes up, go ahead and capture that question in the chat box. And then towards the end of our time, I'll ask our facilitators, Regina and Lloyd, to give us a recap of those questions for us to process at the end. So game changer, being a visionary. It's one of our top kind of game changers that I think what we are going to have to be as a church and as leaders in the post-pandemic world, to be a vital church in the post-pandemic world. So first of all, what is vision? I describe vision as the unique way that each church lives out the mission, right? So we all know the mission, right? Our purpose. Every church has the same purpose, the reason that exists, and that is the Great Commission, right? And that is to make disciples for the transformation of the world. So if every church has the same purpose, I don't know about you, but I have never, ever been in any 2 churches that look alike. So what makes it unique is their vision. the way that they go about fulfilling the mission, living out its purpose. Vision can also be described as God's preferred future, not ours, not our preferences, but what is God's preferred future for your church in the coming year, 2 years? We used to do visioning every 7 to 10 years. Then we did visioning every 5 to 7, then every 3 to 5. And friends, I know this is probably not the news you wanted to hear, but we're having to do visioning ever more often. Why? Well, vision is the intersection of where the needs of the community are, what problem it is that you're being called as the church to solve, as one intersection. The second intersection is, what are the passions of the leaders in your church? Third intersection, the gifts of the congregation. So if you were to draw a Venn diagram, needs of the community, gifts of the congregation, passions of the leaders. The intersection of those three is where vision is born. Now, I thoroughly believe that because we are in an appointment system in the United Methodist Church, that the vision process needs to be a congregational approach. It is driven by our demographics. Our church was anointed and planted in a particular place. And as long as you are in that place, then you are called to serve that community. And so it's important for you to know that community, know their needs. So part of that is figuring out what the needs are. And by needs, or what problem that you're being called to serve, we have to get past transactional needs. What do I mean by transactional? First of all, I'm not saying that meeting transactional needs are a bad thing. Unfortunately, we stop there oftentimes. So let me give you an example. Let's say one of the ways that we're going to figure out what problem we're being called to solve, or what need that we're going to fulfill in our community, is by first having those conversations with community leaders. And that first conversation we're going to have is with the counselor at one of the local schools in your neighborhood. And so I go to the counselor and I say, tell me one of the greatest needs that you're seeing as the counselor of the school for a community. And he or she says, we just have a lot of children come in without socks or with dirty socks. So that's the need. That's the problem to be solved. Okay. And then the second question would be, all right, so tell me, how can the church help meet that need? So then the question is,
You're muted again, Kay.
I think I got muted when everybody else did. Thank you. So when the sock and the sock donation, that is an example of a transactional need. Okay. So instead, what we would want to do is to say, okay, and what else? It's kind of like peeling back the onion. Tell me what else? What other problems? What other problems are to be solved? What we're trying to do is get to a relational problem to be solved. What is a unique problem to be solved, need that we can address, that only the church can address? Any charity can donate socks, but what can we uniquely address that's relational? Because until we are relational, we're not going to be able to build relationships with people so that we have the opportunity to share Christ. As long as it's all transactional, meaning we don't have eyeball to eyeball kind of contact, they'll never know. Okay? So you continually ask those questions. It's important for us to uncover that, and then we go deep in those relationships. It is better to go deep rather than wide. So build a relationship with one organization. In this example, it'd be, what does that relationship look like with that particular school? And we become reading partners. Maybe we become the PTA, where we throw the teacher appreciation luncheon, where we have a host at every table, and so on. So the vision is born by understanding your community, your context, the needs of the community. How do the passions of the leaders in our congregation drive towards that need or problem being solved? And the gifts of the congregation, how do they meet that need? And the vision is born from that. Why is all of this important? Because I find that many churches push back. Oh, we've gone through that process. Yep, it came up with this really, clicky kind of visionary. It rhymes and it looks really cool on a t-shirt and some bumper stickers, but nothing ever happened. It's because we never had a strategic plan for putting it into place. We thought by going through the visioning process that our vision would become a reality. But we never put any goals or strategies in place so that that vision, God's preferred future, would become a reality. So the visioning piece is only part of what we need to do in order for the vision to become a reality. We have to do the planning to make that vision a reality, which means each year, what do we need to do in the life of our church so that that vision, God's preferred future, we become more like it than not. And then we do the steps, we put the ministries in place, we have the events, we put the budget in place, we align our assets towards making that vision come to life. Instead of doing the things we've always done, but by putting this new vision on the wall or on our bulletin, it becomes a reality. We have to be intentional in living into that vision. If you're familiar with the life cycle of a church, when we are growing, vision is leading us, it's guiding us. Vision is what gives your church momentum, excitement, synergy. We're all working together. Without a vision, it's each and every individual person or ministry's own unique idea about where we're going. This is how silos develop, is when we don't have a common vision that we're all working towards. Vision is what unites us. Vision legitimizes leadership. Vision actually perpetuates generosity. Let me just say that it is not very exciting to give to a budget that is all about taking care of the building and paying staff. But if there's a vision like, oh, that's where we're headed, that's pretty cool, that's exciting, we're going to have impact on the community, wow, I can be a part of that, I want to be a part of that. Then people are on board, they want to be involved. So vision is critical in alignment, in growth, and getting people excited. If there is a compelling vision in the life of the church, you walk in and you can feel it. There's a buzz in the air. But you can also walk into a church and know that there is nothing driving it, that it's like directionless. You can also feel that. So that's one way of a visionary game changer. The second is, are we a visionary for the community? Here's what I mean by that. Are we woven into the fabric of the community. When I was working as a judicatory leader, we never got the call to say, why did XYZ church in ABC community close? We didn't get those calls because the church had already become invisible to the community. They had already lost impact. The church closed and nobody noticed. So if your church closed, who would notice? What kind of impact would be lost if your church closed today? So if we have a vision for the community, it means that one of the things that we think about continuously is, what are we doing to have a positive impact for our community, in our community? How do we have a heart for the community? Because if we're called to reach the community, then we need to have our eye on the community. And by the community, I mean outside our building. And sometimes I have people push back and go, well, but we got to take care of us first. But what I find is when we focus outside as our priority, then the inside gets taken care of. But when we focus on the inside, those of us already gathered as the priority, we never quite have the time and energy to focus outside. Think about this. There's something called Net Promoter Score. Now, the secular world has known about this for quite some time, but this is a new concept, evidently for our church world. When I send out mystery worshipers, we're often, we ask two key questions. One of it is, how likely would you be to return? The second question is, how likely would you be to recommend this church? Okay. How likely to return? How likely to recommend? Two key questions. Now, there is a scale of 0 to 10, right? Now, you would think that a 5 is, pretty average. And, we do average a lot in the church. Now, a 9 and a 10 means that person is going to leave as a promoter. So think about this as it relates to a really great restaurant experience. Have you ever gone to a restaurant and you had such an over-the-top experience, like anybody you've come into contact for the next several days? It's like, you're not going to believe what happened to me, at this restaurant. We were seated promptly and our waiter was there, immediately, and our glasses were never less than half full. Our meal was delicious. The chef came out to check on us. The manager came by to see if there was anything else they could do. There was a complimentary dessert because it was our first time. And, the atmosphere was just gorgeous. The temperature was great. And the waiter has such great timing. They seemed to be there when you needed them, but they weren't like there pestering us. They just had that great kind of, it was the best experience that we'd had in quite some time. You couldn't say enough, right? An over-the-top experience. You're a promoter. You're going to tell people about it and what a great experience it was. That's a 9 or a 10. A 7 or 8 is neutral. Most of the time we'd say a 7 or 8, that's really good. No, a 7 or 8 is neutral. We're not going to be a promoter, but we're not going to be saying anything negative. It's just, you're not going to really say anything about it. So you guessed it, 6 and below is what they call a detractor. Now, the further down in the scale you get, obviously, the more of a detractor. But anyone, think of a first-time guest that has a 6 or below kind of experience is going to be a detractor. This isn't just Sunday morning worship either. Anyone who has an experience, a funeral, maybe a voting, anytime they interact, it could be, an HOA meeting. It could be Zumba classes that are hosted there. Who knows? If they walk away with a 6 or under score, they're going to be a detractor. They don't even have to be prompted, and they'll have negative things to say. Think about the ripple effect of those Net Promoter Scores. So what kind of experiences, first impressions, is your community having when they interact in the life of your church? And so what is the community perception of your church? What are you known for? What are you known as? It's important to know, what would your Net Promoter Score be? Are you the 9 and 10 church that has a lot of promoters? You want to be the kind of church that anyone who has ever had any encounter, even if they are not folks that are a part of your congregation, they would still, if someone said, I'm looking for a church, do you have any recommendations? They'd go, well, I go to the Baptist church, but, if you're looking for, a mainline denominational, there's a United Methodist church, and, I had this great experience there. Let me tell you about it. That they still are a promoter, even if they're not a member or an attender, right? That's what we're talking about, is you are so woven into the life of the community because you are giving such a positive vibe in the community, because you have a heart for the community, not because you want a great reputation. It's because you care about the people. Life is better in your community because of your church. So often, Barna did the Barna group, they do a lot of surveys. We, the church, have a negative kind of perception of folks, particularly unchurched, because we're known more for what we're against than what we're for. Hear that? We're known more for what we're against than what we stand for. And the biggest one is, of course, we're known to be hypocrites. So how are you overcoming those kind of negative connotations that are general to the church for your community in general? How are we showing empathy for our community? Now, the third kind of visionary would be, how do you have a vision for the individual people in your community? How are you carrying the burdens of your community? Do you have a heart for the people? How are we transforming lives? Remember, we're to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Are lives being transformed in your community because your church is there? If someone who's a seeker were to drop in because they were looking for hope, they were desperate, and they were to come as a part of your worship experience, like, I've tried everything else, I'm going to drag myself in there. Would they find that hope? Would they be welcomed with open arms, not judged? Would they find a relevant worship experience that they could embrace that would be contextual for a seeker? That would offer them that love and hope and grace that they're looking for? Would they feel a community that they could be a part of? Are we planning worship for those that are already gathered? Or do we put an emphasis on planning worship for those yet to be gathered, for those that we're trying to reach? Most of you have probably read all the statistics on mental health. There was already a crisis in particular in our Gen Z generation. It has tripled and quadrupled during the pandemic around suicide, depression, and anxiety. What are the statistics in your local community around those? And how are you meeting those needs? People are craving community, finding a connection with people. And in specific, they're looking for hope, love, peace, and grace. If they can't find it anywhere else, I sure hope we can find that in the body of Christ. But friends, for people just to show up in worship, they don't do that like they used to. We're going to have to find ways to intersect in the community with the folks that are looking for that. But we have to have a heart for the community and the people in order to think about that in new ways. We just can't think about in, okay, well, we'll be here when they show up. Because in today's context, when we, the church, are the minority, we have to think about it in all new ways. So I'd like to move on now to the next game changer, which is spiritually grounded. So to be an effective, vital church in the post-pandemic world, we have to be spiritually grounded. Now, doesn't this go without saying? I'm sure most of you are probably thinking, yeah. First of all, we have to be grounded in prayer. In most meetings that I attend, we normally turn to our paid prayer in the group, is what I call it. We have to get over that. For the laity in the room, we do not have a paid prayer. We all have to become comfortable in praying. If we are not comfortable praying with our peers, how are we ever going to become comfortable praying in the community, praying with the person who is needing that grace or that sense of hope in the community? So when I'm working with leadership groups, usually that's around simplified accountable structure, we tell our pastor, you can take your turn, but you're not the one that always prays. Because as spiritual leaders, everyone takes a turn. And in our prayer teams, it's not just about the joys and concerns of those that are already gathered. In the work I do in The Greatest Expedition, one of the books I commissioned was The Open Road with Sue Nelson Kibbe, which is kind of her next series in breakthrough prayer. And when you're talking about breakthrough prayer, it's like, God, show us what bold new doors that you want us to walk through. God, show us what burden it is that you want us to carry for our community. Do you hear that? You're asking. You're asking for burdens. You're asking for what bold things do you want us to do? So what kind of breakthrough prayer is maybe God calling on your leaders or your congregation for this time? And how is everything that we're doing grounded in prayer? Are we modeling that even through choir practice? Is it opening and ending in prayer? Is your trustee meeting opening and ending in prayer? Is your ceramics class opening and ending in prayer? The next piece of this is spiritual depth. How is everything that we're doing intentionally discipling? So if that's what we're about, right? That's our purpose, is to disciple people, to become disciple makers. I hope you heard that too. Is there is an intention that we multiply, not that we just continue in our own spiritual development, become more Christ-like, but as we become more Christ-like, there's an expectation that we bring others with us to know Christ and to become more Christ-like. Right? I think we also have to bust the myth that being a disciple is not just about head knowledge. It's not just about sitting and knowing more Bible stories. But as a disciple, my lifestyle changes, my behavior changes, my attitude changes into more Christ-like. So often we think about discipleship as intellect, as knowledge, but it's a way of being, as we know. So do you have an intentional discipleship pathway? So if we're all about disciple making, how are we helping people get onto a disciple pathway and taking always their next step? And so every ministry in your church, is it leading them to the pathway and their next step on the pathway? A lot of times if we do have a pathway, it's kind of this thing over here, but our ministries aren't necessarily connected to it. So it feels like this dangling thing out here, but people don't necessarily know how to connect the rest of the life of the congregation. So help them connect all of the pieces together, that they should be all the one. So how does the sermon help them take their next step in discipleship? How does their Sunday school class help them take their next step in their discipleship pathway? How does serving help them take their next step in their discipleship pathway? Right? Because it's about discipleship, not membership. Because I'm sure you all noticed that our membership, especially in our older churches, not age, but if churches have been in existence for more than 10 or 15 years, typically the membership is 2 to 4 times the number of attendance, even more so post-pandemic or endemic, right? Because membership didn't mean anything. We put no responsibility around that. It was almost like it was privilege. We put no expectation around it. So it's about discipleship, okay? The other thing would be, let's make sure we put mature disciples, spiritual leaders in leadership. Now, as a 4th generation United Methodist, I was taught that nominations go something like this. For trustees, you need people in the building industry, plumbers, electricians, contractors, because that's what we're going to do there. SPRC, we need HR professionals. Finance, you need, bankers and wealth advisors. That's gotten us into trouble, friends. Because what we are saying then is this is the most important thing, is that you have that secular experience. And therefore, then, it didn't matter where you were in your discipleship. It didn't matter if you didn't attend worship. It didn't matter if you were not in the Word, if you weren't serving, if you weren't a tither. And then we wondered why we got off mission. So the churches I work with, I think we need to completely stand our nominations committee practices on their head and say, wipe all of that secular thing off the table as your primary indicator of who you're looking for. Let's look at our spiritually mature disciples first. Then let's bring them in and have conversations. Tell me where God's working on you most recently. Share with us about your prayer life. How is it that you work on your discipleship pathway? Tell us about that journey. Tell us about the last time that you shared your faith with someone. Tell us about that experience. Now, can you imagine a nominations committee having those kind of conversations? And then they pray together and they discern, rather than picking at the pictorial and saying, let's see, who haven't we got on leadership now? And then we have the conversation around who should call based on who would be the most likely to get a yes out of that person. And then we set expectations low to say, oh, it's okay. It won't take much of your time. Because we set the bar so low so that we can get a yes, because it's about filling out the paper and getting a yes more than it is about having the spiritual leader at the table who is going to lead the church well in its mission of making disciples. We're better off not to have leaders, not to have that ministry, than to have the wrong leaders, wrong people, maybe they're not even leaders, at the table, and leading us in a way that is not helpful or that is not on mission. But we become driven by the wrong things. We become driven by, we got to fill out the paperwork. And setting the bar low in order to do that. Because in my experience, when we turn that leadership model and nominations model upside down, and we get mature spiritual leaders at the table, it changes the whole conversation. And it changes the direction of the church. Because then we can talk about, how are we aligning all of our assets, leveraging our assets, so that our church is making disciples who disciple others? Because they get it, because they're mature spiritual leaders. Because mature spiritual leaders know it's no longer about them. Mature spiritual leaders have a much higher level of commitment. Much more likely to serve. They're more generous, more dependable. They're bolder leaders. And therefore, they're more likely to be the risk takers for the mission. Not risk for the sake of risk. But if they believe it and they believe that that work is where God's calling us, they're willing to risk leading the congregation in that direction because they believe that that is God's preferred future. So who is modeling what leadership is for your church. In one church I was working with, I was doing an interview, and I just felt like something was kind of off. And so I referenced, well, they've talked about that the last couple of Sundays in worship. And he said, well, I'm not in worship. You're not in worship? Isn't that one of your covenants, as a leader? What covenant? Oh. And he said, I don't attend worship here. I like, ever? No. You're a member here? Yeah, I've been a member since I was a kid. I said, oh. So I laughed and I said, oh, you must be a big giver then, because that would be the only other reason it would make sense, right? Is that they would be a big giver, that they would be the finance chair. And he said, why would I give? I don't attend here. And I said, excuse me, but I'm terribly confused. How would you be the finance chair if you don't attend? You're not a giver. I said, do you lead a ministry area? Do you serve it? He said, I'm not involved in the life of this church at all. I said, again, I'm even more confused then. How did you end up finance chair? And he said, well, you see, my mother is on nominations and they couldn't find anyone else. So she begged me to take it. And I said, how long have you been doing this? And he said, oh, I don't know, 5-7 years. Who's on your team? I don't have a team. That is what the leadership looked like in that church. And you'd be shocked to hear, right, that they were a declining church that was reaching no one in their neighborhood, right? So who are we raising up to say, this is what leadership looks like? This is what leadership acts like in our church? I think we have to be careful to say, this is our expectations. This is what leadership is about in our church, right? So not only are we having an intentional discipleship pathway, but I'm sure all of you would remember that it's not just the nominations committee, but it's the committee on nominations and leadership development. So what is your leadership development process? And might I even say, what's our spiritual leadership development process? Oftentimes we'd say, well, let's do the nominations committee. That's the committee that only meets for a month or two a year. That's the easy one to serve on. But that was never the intention. The intention was that this would be the group that was also raising up leaders. So what's your leadership development pipeline? We think that leaders are raised up now in the secular world, and then we're looking for those out in our congregation. They're already leaders to serve. But it used to be that leaders were raised in the church and sent out as spiritual leaders to lead in the community. So how can we get back to that we're sending Christian values out into the community? And then you already have people in the pipeline when you go back to nominations next year, instead of flipping through the pictorial trying to figure out who you can twist their arm to be a leader. But better yet, a mature spiritual leader to lead its church in its mission of making disciples. So each of these game changers, being a visionary, being spiritually grounded, have this assessment, 0 to 10. I want you to think about, where would you place your church on that spectrum? How visionary is your church? How spiritually grounded is your church? And then, are you gathering a group at your church to have a conversation and to build on what strengths and to process the questions around how we might be better visionaries and spiritually grounded. All right, so let's stop there for today and see what questions that we might have.
We do have one. How are these personal touch activities supported by the virtual church advocated last week?
I'm sorry, would you repeat the question for me, please, Lloyd?
How are these personal touch activities supported by the virtual church advocated last week?
Personal touch activities. Help me understand what you're referring to.
I don't know. Eric, do you want to unmute and speak to that?
Yes. Thank you, Eric.
Hi, Kay.
Hi, Eric.
I got the feeling that you're talking about people being in the same room, talking to each other, sharing their feelings. And I don't see how that is supported in a virtual church sense, because there is so much more experienced when you are in person, as you well know, than you can ever get from looking at a monitor screen.
The relational piece that I was talking about. Yeah, okay, gotcha. What we're finding, and believe it or not, that some people are willing to even take those first steps in those virtual. So even taking it from a worship experience. So there's a worship experience, and the worship host is saying, here's a Zoom link. If you want to join me for virtual coffee, and we're just going to hang out and have coffee together, and I'll answer any questions and we can get to know one another. And so they pop over to another room and they just share conversation and build a relationship there. So that is happening, and people are comfortable doing those kinds of activities. As a matter of fact, they're more comfortable doing that sometimes than they are in person as a first step.
Well, I understand that, but believe it or not, our congregation has people that don't even own a computer.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So their computer is their cell phone.
Yep. So that can happen on a cell phone too.
Yeah, but you still miss that physical interaction with one another. And to me, that's what church is all about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't happen when you're doing it virtually in any sense of the word.
And some people feel differently. The idea is that we get to a point that there is some human contact, and it may not necessarily be in church on Sunday, but it may be in a coffee shop. It may be in a smaller group setting. So I don't think we can always be driving to the point of driving people into a Sunday morning experience like we think it looks like. But yes, we're driving towards a relationship that looks more in person than not. However, I don't want us to also believe that relationship can only be built in person. Because they take, for instance, how many people are meeting online? I mean, relationships start online, like, you meet on, whatever dating app that ends up being a relationship. It starts virtual, and over time they become comfortable, and then they begin meeting and it turns into something else.
Hey, if I can say a word about this.
Sure.
Sometimes, Eric, the church is decades behind the rest of culture in identifying how to do things. I'll give you an example. My son is very involved in the online gaming community. He has friends from around the world that as they play a video game together, they have a chat feature that they talk to each other. He has become very good friends with these people around the world. He's got a friend in Texas. They will go on Netflix and choose and watch a movie together and talk online or on their cell phone as they watch the movie, and are very good friends. They send each other presents. They probably are closer friends than sometimes people sitting next to each other in a pew on a Sunday. So the world around us has figured out how to have touch in virtual settings that the church is only now, because of a pandemic, considering. And those interactions are just as real and sometimes deeper than what happens in many churches on Sunday mornings, where it's very superficial. I have sometimes asked people to look around them, and many of the people sitting around them, they can't tell you how many children they have or where they live, or if any of those children have had a tragedy. So physical proximity hasn't always led to intimacy. And we're to learn how to do this. It's hard. It's very hard because it's not in our mindset. But this new world isn't going to go away after the pandemic. And as Kay, I think, is trying to tell us, we got to embrace how to do this.
Thank you. Yeah, it gives me a little bit different insight on it. Thank you.
Stacy?
Well, first, I want to thank you, Kay, for your book. It's very encouraging and inspiring. And so specifically, I had an aha moment when you spoke about the lay leadership and nominations committee. And so my question is, how, I guess I could use the book to be the catalyst to invigorate the committee. It's kind of hard when you come into a new setting and you don't know who the individuals are, and you're working with who's in place.
Sure.
But in order to gently pivot, navigate, move forward, would that be the best place to bring it, to be able to have the vision birthed out of and flow through, if you will? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And Stacy, let me just make sure I'm understanding your question. This is the pivot of thinking about doing nominations in a different way.
Exactly.
Okay. So,
Exactly.
so let me offer 3 different options for you. One of those is if you're looking for a leadership development process, Phil Schrader and I wrote it kind of here's a process in a box. It's a place to start. It may not be where you end, but at least it's a starting point just to give you a format. It's called Launching Leaders. So he's out of the North Georgia conference. He was a developer. He's now back at a large church there in the Atlanta area, Launching Leaders. So the first part is, here's how leadership characteristics and spiritual disciplines kind of interact with one another. And then the second half of the book is, here's kind of 6 different sessions that you could have and it's the format. I mean, it's just like plug and play, 6 different sessions for leadership development. Okay. So that's one resource. Second resource, sometimes it's easier to throw like people like me under the bus. I can say the things that you don't have to say, right? It's easier for me to say it than you, because you have to live with them. Right afterwards.
Right.
So there is a video that myself and Blake Bradford, who is another colleague of mine, who wrote Mission Possible, which is around simplified accountable structure, which is where this whole nominations thing is birthed from. And on my website, kkotan.com/SAS, which stands for Simplified Accountable Structure, SAS, lowercase, there is a little video on there for nominations training, and it talks about this model, right?
Okay.
It's a training piece. So
Okay.
maybe it's helpful for it to come from someone else. The third piece is, now this is going to open up another can of worms. So that's why it's number 3, because you may not want to go here. But if you're wanting to flip the whole leadership piece, then Mission Possible gets you to simplified accountable structure, and nominations is one piece of that.
We have a question. Could you say?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have another question, but can you say more on the importance of visioning?
Yeah. So visioning. So when vision is driving, you're a growing vital congregation. Vision followed by relationships, and in particular external relationships. When structure is driving, calendar, money, building, and the way you make decisions, then you're declining. So again, when we've got vision, you have synergy, energy, excitement. Leaders are like, oh, I know what to do. It's not like I'm wondering what to do. And I use the word legitimatizes because it's like, that's where the congregation has set their vision. And so it gives me permission to go in that direction. It's not like I just decided on my own. Vision legitimatizes leadership, right? And because there's a shared vision, generosity is much higher because people are excited about where we're headed because we painted a picture of where we're going versus we're meandering in the wilderness. So without vision, we don't know where we're going, and all of those things are absent. With vision, it creates all of those things. So I can't say enough about vision, and vision leaks. You have to continuously talk about vision and align everything to vision. You can't do it once, put it on the wall and forget it and hope and pray it happens. It has to be intentional and strategic to live into it.
Okay, this isn't a question, but I'll give this to you as a final thought and see if you have any final comment you want to make related to it. The Bible says, do not give up meeting in person. For me, Panera is an area of ministry.
Right. Yep. Anyway, to me, anywhere is a place of ministry. Anywhere that you see people is a potential place for ministry. And I think God nudges us in all different kinds of ways to it's like batter up. And a lot of times we ignore ways that God puts us in places to do random acts of kindness, to bless people and to share our faith. And we ignore them because we're afraid. Or we think that there's this separation of church life and the marketplace. And there is not. There is not. We have been conditioned to think that there is, but there is not. And when we get over that, I think we're going to live in a new world. So next time, friends, we're going to be talking about commitment and one of my favorite ones, innovation. Commitment and innovation is next time. So I know that the hours go by, our hour goes by fast. So I just appreciate you allowing me to feed you every week with a fire hose. But I hope that you're able to read along to fill in the other places that we're not able to go in the hour, and that you're processing with a group so that you're able to get some traction back at the church, because that's what this is all about. It isn't really about this 1 hour you're spending with me, but hopefully it's about what's happening back at your church, that something is transformed back at your church because of your commitment and your time here. So thank you so much for spending this hour with me, and hope you have a blessed and great day. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye,
Kay.
everybody.
Bye.